when the sirens echoed across the Gulf this week, sounding over the hangars of Bahrain and the logistical hubs of Kuwait, the headlines immediately reached for the language of total conflict. They told you of an unprovoked assault, a sudden lashing out by a regime seeking chaos. But in the quiet rooms where history is actually written, the spaces between the cables and the military briefings, the narrative is far more clinical. What we are witnessing is not a random outburst of regional violence. It is the tactical activation of a long-standing strategic trap, a moment where the very architecture of American power in the Middle East has been forced to reveal its own inherent fragility. We have to look past the smoke to see the board, and right now, the board is being fundamentally redesigned. To understand why this is happening, we must set aside the immediate adrenaline of the news cycle and examine the recent past. Washington has spent the last few years operating under a specific assumption that it can maintain a persistent, high-intensity presence across the Gulf, commanding the shipping lanes, patrolling the skies, and anchoring its logistics in sovereign states like Kuwait and Bahrain. Without that presence becoming a permanent lightning rod for instability, this strategy relies on the belief that American power is a force of gravity that holds the region in place. But Iran has spent that same time developing a counter-strategy, one based not on matching American carrier groups or air power, which would be a futile endeavor, but on shifting the political and economic costs of that presence until it becomes unsustainable for the host nations themselves. When American forces conducted their recent operations against Iranian radar, naval assets, and logistics, they were aiming for a decisive assertion of control over the Strait of Hormuz. It was a projection of strength meant to signal that Washington, not Tehran, sets the terms of global energy transit. But that very assertion of strength created an immediate pressure point. Iran did not respond by trying to match that military weight in a conventional sense. Instead, they targeted the American assets sitting on Allied soil by aiming at a Patriot battery in Kuwait and fuel infrastructure in Bahrain. Iran achieved something far more potent than any single kinetic strike. They turned the logistical bedrock of American power into a liability for the governments that host it. Consider the dilemma this creates for those Gulf capitals. These nations have long balanced their security partnerships with Washington against their geographic reality as neighbors to Iran. They have functioned as the platform for American operations because they believed that the umbrella of Americans' protection shielded them from the costs of that proximity. Now, however, the umbrella has become a lightning rod. Every time a missile is fired at an American installation within their borders, the host government is forced to manage a domestic crisis. They must navigate the anxiety of their own populations, the anger of business communities concerned about stability, and the realization that their territory is no longer a passive base, but a frontline participant in a conflict they likely hope to avoid. This is where the geopolitical chess game enters a far more dangerous phase. If Gulf leaders start to quietly signal that their participation comes at too high a price, the entire logistical network that sustains the Fifth Fleet and American Army operations across the theater begins to tremble. It is an asymmetric reality. Iran does not need to defeat the United States in a traditional battle to win this engagement. It only needs to make the cost of American access higher than the political and economic comfort of the host nations can bear. If the host countries begin to demand that Washington restrain its operations to avoid dragging them into the line of fire, the strategic map of the Middle East will be forced into a realignment that could take years to stabilize. We must also confront the terrifying volatility of the current environment. With multiple actors operating in such a confined geographic space, we are seeing the rise of unclaimed and contested strikes. When an explosion occurs and no one admits responsibility, the space for diplomatic resolution shrinks to near zero. The economic implications are just as profound and far more immediate for the average citizen in the West. When tankers are threatened and insurance premiums spike, the markets do not wait for the actual loss of oil. They react to the mere prospect of disruption. When you fill your tank or pay an energy bill, you are paying the price of the insecurity generated in these narrow waters. As the machinery of this conflict continues to churn, we are left to wonder if we are witnessing the inevitable decline of a long-standing regional order, and what exactly will be waiting to take its place once the smoke finally clears.